And we are live. So, welcome, Robbie. Finally, we did miss out on one the other day, but I understand there's very valid reasons for that. So, let's leave it there and just get straight on. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you don't need any introduction to anybody who follows me because so many people ask me, and this is an actual truth. I get told you should interview this person or you should talk to this person, and your name probably comes up more than any other name. And I keep saying, well, I've actually interviewed Robbie, and Robbie's interviewed me. And in fact, you were the very first person I interviewed when I started doing this. I'm not sure
Yeah,
if you're aware of that. I was in Beijing that time, and I interviewed you, which was a bit of a change because you interviewed me, and you were one of the first people to interview me when I started being a kind of vlogger on China. So
yeah,
we've got
that's
this
right.
connection. Yeah, we've got this connection. Or I have this connection. I have an affinity with Robbie Barwick of the Citizens Party. So welcome back. And
Thanks.
uh, let's start with the banking system in Australia is going through a process of, I would call it dynamic change, and is going through investigations into what needs to change, why it needs to change, and how it's going to change. And it's you and your Citizens Party that is driving that. Can you give us an update on what's happening?
Yeah, so one of the sort of the foundation platforms of our party, the Citizens Party, is um, we believe that the people, as represented democratically or supposedly in the government,
Mm.
um, should be the final authority on how the system works. Right? I mean, that's what a democracy is. That you govern with the consent of the governed. And when you have a situation where certain interests become more powerful than the democratic system, well, that's not a democracy anymore. That's something
Mhm.
else. And in fact, there's a very famous Franklin Roosevelt quote from 1938 where he said, "The liberty of a democracy, if not, is not safe if people tolerate the growth of a private power to the point where it becomes more powerful than the government itself. That, in its essence, is fascism." He was defining what fascism was, and of course, when fascism was at its height, with Hitler and Mussolini, etc. Right. So, um, we have, unfortunately, in the West, we this is not unique to Australia. We have a broken system. If it was working, this is the thing, Jerry. If it was working, people like me would have less traction.
Yeah,
There would be
you
more
wouldn't have anything
principles
to
behind
do.
it, but it's not working, right?
Mm.
The financial system is not meeting the needs of the people, and I can give you a million chapters and verses on that. But our argument is the problem is it's working for somebody, and in a sense, it's serving itself. So the elite bankers and consultants in the big four consultancy companies like PwC and Ernst and Young and KPMG, etc. And you got a few others like Boston Consulting and others. They form this cozy little club, and they do really well out of it, right? But the public do not. And so we've been criticizing it for years. Our party's foundation policy is to bring back a government-owned bank, which can
Mhm.
be a cornerstone of our financial system, and so it can provide stability. It can provide essential services for people. It'll make a profit, but it's not there to maximize its profit. So it can provide credit in areas of the economy that the other banks won't, etc. That's our cornerstone policy. Um, but this is now coming to a head for a number of reasons. So there's a couple. One is the banks seem to be no longer fit for purpose in terms of providing a service to the public, and they don't want to. So we have this
Mhm.
big debate in Australia, and this is not dissimilar to other jurisdictions. Technology has allowed the banks to do what they would have loved to have always done, which is get maximum profit for minimum service,
Right.
right? And it's one thing if we're all, I know China, for instance, from what I've heard, is one of the most advanced places in the world in terms of the ability to pay electronically. They're the masters of it. Elon Musk is jealous of WeChat, right? He wants to
Yep.
turn X into WeChat, right? The ultimate
Mm.
app. So it's one thing to have the technology is great. I use the technology. The technology is great. But what we've got is banks that want to force everybody to use the technology before they're ready, and that means the elderly and the disabled and the people that are not comfortable with the technology. They want to force them to use it and take away things like cash. They want to force us to use the technology before the infrastructure is ready. Look at this map behind me. That is a massive country.
Yep.
With 25, 26, we might have
about
27
million.
I can't remember. Might be 27 million people now, right?
Yep.
I just drove 6 hours each way, 6.5 hours each way from Melbourne to South Australia. And there were, between towns, 100-kilometre, distances, right? And between towns, my phone wasn't working. But the banks don't care about that. They want to push people to take it. What they're doing is they're closing branches and saying to people, you can bank online. And for the people out there, they can't bank online, right? It's not reliable. And the banks don't care. And we've got 4 banks, especially, that are the pillars of our financial system, but they're an oligopoly. And the government has allowed them to become too powerful. And so this has now caused a big backlash. And what we were able to do was get an inquiry into this specific problem of why the banks are so aggressively shutting branches and taking away the ability of people to do their banking face to face. And it's focused on rural areas. Mm-hmm. And the inquiry has become really powerful because it's like, left to their own devices. One of the problems in a democratic system like ours, which is a far more superior system than what you live there in China, of course, Jerry, that's by definition. We know that. We were brought up being taught that, right?
Right.
One of the problems is politicians, they actually get swamped. And so they have to prioritize issues. And the prioritization of issues is not based on merit. It's based on noise. It's based on power. It's based on influence, right? Mm-hmm. And so this was being ignored until we got noisy enough to combat the power of the banks and make the politicians realize, well, hang on, we better look at this, because at the end of the day, the banks don't vote for us, the public does, right? And so we got this inquiry. But it's working really, really well. It's bringing out the best in the politicians. The hearing I saw yesterday, when the senators all listened to all the testimony from the local townspeople about how disruptive this has been, losing their banks, etc. Mm-hmm. Then the bank one bank turned up. When the bank sat down, I was making a joke to the office here. It's like a werewolf movie, and the full moons come out, and these senators, you can see the hair on the back of their neck go up. You can see their fangs grow. You can see their claws grow, right? And they went for these banks, and they really did. And these banks are not used to being treated like the senators in our parliament have been treating them in these hearings, and like I saw yesterday. And it's exactly what the banks need, and it's what the senators need, that experience, to make them realize, hang on, a lot of this problem is because we shirked our responsibility as government. We're the government. We are ultimately responsible. We shirked our responsibility and thought, oh, well, that's a private sector thing. It's got nothing to do with us. And the public's saying, well, hang on, who's in charge? Aren't you in charge? And this is starting to get the senators to see that again. And the contrast, of course, to a place like China is no one in China doubts that the government is ultimately in charge, right? And the government shows that the corporations in China are not more powerful than the government. But in our country, they have been for too long. And ideologically, some people like that, but the majority of people don't. They actually want to say, hang on, we expect the government to be the ultimate authority. Yeah, you want the business to have freedoms to do what businesses do, etc. But there has to be some social responsibility. And it's the government that has to hold them to that. And now we've got a process that's actually working, I think, to make that happen. And it's been really great to be part of. And we've driven it, as you said.
Yeah. Do you think that some of these senators have in the past received, in an American system, they call it lobbying. I know that doesn't exist to the same degree in Australia, but are there some of your senators influenced by potential donations to their campaigns and things like that, which is what affects American democracy?
It's less direct than in America, but it's just as much there. Well, the reason I say it's less direct is because in America, the individual senators there and members of the House of Representatives, they do a lot of individual fundraising. They run their own television ads, etc. And they're constantly. There was this guy, Stephen. I think it's the right guy. I might be quoting the wrong guy. I think it was this Democratic congressman named Stephen Israel, and that's why I remember I think I'm remembering the name right because it's an unusual name.
Mm.
He quit a few years ago, and he almost blew the whistle in a sense on this. He said, "Look, it's impossible to be a congressman. You spend 96% of your time fundraising."
Yes, I've
Right?
seen that quote.
Yeah. So like it's a really big debilitating problem in America. In Australia, it's the parties that fundraise, right? Less
Right.
so than the individuals. Some individuals will have more of a role in it, but it's the banks donate to the parties, but they do donate. So we've got since 2022, we've had a Labor government, and they replaced a Liberal National Coalition government, which had been in place for the previous 13 years. In that 13 years, the banks had donated something like $12 million to the coalition government, but $9 million to the Labor Party.
Okay.
And so the Labor Party is almost as indebted to them as the coalition.
Right.
And these figures may not seem big by American standards, but they're significant in the Australian context because you have a smaller population.
Mm-hmm.
And the Labor Party is almost as indebted to them as the Liberals are, the coalition.
But not the individual senators or members of parliament.
No, that's right. So what happens is on any given day, they can express their opinion. If it gets too dangerous in terms of offending the vested interests that are donated to the party, the leadership of the party will rein them in. Right? But at an event like yesterday, the leadership of the party is not there. They're responding in the moment to what they're seeing, and they didn't hold back.
Oh, great!
Right? That was really good to see.
Was the media there?
Well, funny story.
Yeah.
The media do come to these things. Yesterday, there wasn't. It's usually the local media. When we go to a town, it's usually the local media. But this did get media coverage. But the way it got media coverage, and this is rich. So as you know, Jerry, the dominant media company in Australia is the Murdoch Media, News Corp. And they own something like 80% of the newspapers and whatever. And they've got
they own the only in Adelaide or in South Australia. They own the only one, which is I think is the Advertiser. In Brisbane, it's the Courier Mail. In Melbourne, it's the Age. Is it the Age? They don't know. Yeah, they own in there's 4 cities where they own the only media basically.
The Advertiser in Adelaide is Rupert's original and first.
Yes, that's where he started his life. Yeah,
his baby. It's the one his dad left him in his will. Anyway, they also own the Australian equivalent of Fox News, which is Sky News.
Yeah.
And if you want to now, it may not be quite as bad now, but up until for the last few years, if you just got onto the Sky News YouTube page and click the videos tab, so you see all the videos they post in order. What you would see, just take a step back and scroll back. What you would see is anti-China propaganda Inc.
Yeah.
Right? Like 2 out of 3 videos were always, blasting China. Anyway, that's just as an aside. That it's full on. Yesterday, the news service, the Sky News service in the morning was reporting on this hearing. And that was good. And I'm listening to the television news report and I'm thinking, hang on, that sounds familiar. I wrote those words. They took our press release, because we put out a press release the day before about this hearing. They took our press release and they just read it as their script, word for word, without attributing it to us. Right?
Wow.
No attribution whatsoever. But, and I'm getting it's bittersweet, right? Because I'm glad, like a party like us works hard to get publicity. We do a lot, and we don't get anywhere near the publicity we deserve. But I'm happy with that. They obviously took notice of it. But come on, I'm thinking, come on, Sky News, don't be cheap. Attribute it to us. What they did do, though, which made me happy afterwards, is we had quoted an academic from the University of Wollongong, Dr. Andy Schmulo, in our press release, and they went and contacted him and did an interview with him about the issue. And that ended up being the single best bit of television coverage of this whole issue for the whole campaign. And I was really, really happy because this professor is really sharp. And he was showing the point that the Australian taxpayer supports these banks enormously. There's a massive subsidy for the banks. The banks owe something back for that, and that was the essence of his point. But he expressed it really well. He gave the details, and that ended up being excellent coverage as part of a trend of a lot of coverage for this issue. So in general, this issue is getting almost wall-to-wall coverage compared to what it was a few years ago, and because everyone's realizing, hang on, this is a problem that must be solved.
Yeah, people are starting to realize. I mean, we don't notice the problem when it affects us individually, but when we start seeing people, like I see your tweets and I see, wow, this is a big problem, and it did affect me individually, or does affect me individually when I go back to Australia. For me, it's a particularly bad problem because my daughter lives in the middle of nowhere, and there isn't a bank nearby. I mean, she's recently moved there. It didn't affect me before when she lived on the Gold Coast or in Brisbane, so that wasn't a big deal. But when she moved to the middle of nowhere in New South Wales, it's certainly become a problem now. How do I go down there, and how do I live? Because my WeChat isn't going to work, that's for sure.
That's right.
That's a different story. You talked about. I want to come back to one thing that you said just a little while ago. You said that the comment that Roosevelt made about around the height of fascism. Do you think we're seeing a rise of that again? Not so much in Australia, although there's touches of it. But do you think we're seeing it in the US?
Oh, for sure. But Australia too, because the most important thing about fascism is it is an economic system, and what we tend to remember is the authoritarian, stuff, the jackboots. But the jackboots were enforcing an economic system, and that economic system, at its heart, is this idea that there's this private economic power that has to be out of reach of government authority, because you cannot have this pesky thing called democracy interfere with it. It's so much more important, right? And these are the people who get to buy democracy and manipulate it. And I've come to conclude that one of the reasons that these governments, like in the United States, talk about democracy so much, even though the word's not even in the American Constitution, funnily enough, right? Their founding fathers did not see themselves as starting a democracy. They tried to constrain democracy so they didn't get mob rule. But they talk about democracy so much because if you're the elite now and you've got this concentration of media power, and that's a really big part of this picture, the way the media can manipulate public opinion. The British didn't invent it, but they mastered it. Divide and conquer, right? Divide and rule. The way to rule is you divide the opposition against you. And these two-party systems are, by definition, divide and rule. You keep the public divided between only two alternatives, right? And nothing ever changes. And of course, the late great John Pilger did that excellent film on the coming war on China.
Yeah,
he interviewed the Chinese academic who made the point that in the West you can change the party, but you can't change the policy. In China, you can't change the party, but you can change the policy. And we lived through that.
That was Eric Lee.
Yeah, but at its essence, it is this. It's who has economic power, right? Because economic power is the fundamental power, and the military stuff and the policing stuff supports that economic power. Who are the establishment? Who really controls it? And we would like to think that the people in power are the ones who represent us. And in practice, we can make it work. I think we can make it work that way. That's why I work really hard in a political party in Australia to assert the power of people and show people how to have influence, and so they don't give up and vacate the field to these powerful vested economic interests. Yeah. But it's very hard. And what's happened over the decades, there was a period of time, Jerry, which is probably more your era than my era. I came on the end of it. But you had this post-war period where all the governments of the world tended to acknowledge, if you will, the Roosevelt position, right? And Roosevelt helped set up the Bretton Woods system, and we had Bretton Woods until the 70s. And the whole point of Bretton Woods, now, even though that created the United States as the world's reserve currency, people were happy with that system because the US had a powerful economy then that could back up that status as the world's reserve currency, which it doesn't have now, provide the stability. you had 2.5 decades there of the greatest investment growth the world's ever seen. And the only thing that competes with that is China's individual story since then, right? But what happened was different governments came along with an agenda to change that. And they used all these populist arguments, and Margaret Thatcher was one in the UK. Reagan did it. Paul Keating and Bob Hawke did it here. And suddenly it's like, oh, no, we've got to get government out of the way. You've got to have the free market. And in a real extreme version of the argument is this Javier Milei in Israel, Argentina now, right? I mean, he's it's just privatizing everything. But by what you're doing is you're saying to people, oh, look, government's incompetent. They can't run anything. So we've got to hand it over to the private sector. Well, you're not just handing over the management. With that goes the power. And then you're creating this system that Roosevelt described, where the power of this private ownership class is more powerful than the government itself.
Yeah.
And then they have to protect it, right? And so America's gone crazy. We can see that because you've got this myth that the fact that they've got these social media companies that are so big, right? They think that is the new economy. Well, and it's not unimportant, but they can't do the things, the basics they used to do. That if you don't have those basics, like they're being able to produce cars and electricity systems and
manufacturing
roads and rails and infrastructure, that is the basics that the social media stuff can build on. But if that's all you've got, you're actually really, really weak. But there's so much money tied up in that. And the American system of government is so corrupted by what we've already talked about, the need to get the donations off these rich people. There's no way in a million years they can turn around and say, okay, well, no, we're going to start representing the 99%, not the 1%. And that's effectively, fascism as a system, an economic system. And then throw on top of that the power of the military industrial complex, which just is running the whole show. And the police forces in America are tied up in that. They're an extension now of the military industrial complex. They're almost required to buy the policing weapons. It's not just like it's military grade stuff that all these police forces have, etc., to suppress the population. It just seems to be shambles.
So Lawai's just made a very good point here. This is a friend of mine in Shenzhen, not Lawai 86 in America, 86 Lawai. You know what I'm talking about.
I know.
If you're going to make a profit on everything, many people talk about the infrastructure in China and say, oh, it's a loss maker. The high-speed rail doesn't make money. Well, it does. It makes money for the country because it improves the livelihoods of everybody in the region that the train goes to. So that's something that's very well worth remembering.
Public infrastructure should never be required to make a profit in its own right. It's there so the country makes a profit.
Yeah, I tend to stay away. Sorry, I tend to stay away from ideology, but one of the things that I've noticed about China is it actually still matches its constitution. Its constitution says that it is a dictatorship of the proletariat. And when you were talking a little while ago, I was thinking, that sounds like a dictatorship of the proletariat. That sounds like what democracy really ought to be. And a lot of people don't realize this, but there is an organization called the National People's Congress, which are not the Communist Party. Many of the members are communists, but they don't need to be members of the party. They don't need to do anything except be upstanding members of their community. And then they get selected, nominated, and elected to represent their region to supervise the party. So they make suggestions to the government. They supervise the government's implementation of it. And this is a part of what's called the rubber stamp parliament. It actually works really, really well behind the scenes.
Well, I think you grow up. Well, and I grew up on the tail end of the Cold War, and I've had to rethink all my assumptions as I've got older and sort of learned more.
And me too.
This idea that democracy is defined as something where the people get to vote every 3 or 4 years or something, and then and maybe change the government, maybe not, but make no difference in the meantime. I've come to conclude it's actually a bit of a joke, especially when you see how it works in practice. in our countries. Whereas what democracy really is the government governing with the consent of the governed. And how do you know what the consent is? What is the mechanism to know that? And a 3-year vote is not the only mechanism, right? You can have Switzerland has citizens' initiative and referenda, so that the people will say, well, we're going to vote on this subject right now. So that's the way they do it.
Right.
China has its own way, right? Which is a consultative. You get people elected to that body that you just described, but then it's a consultative thing. They're always trying to find out, what do the people need and how do we deliver it? Well, by my definition, or I think any reasonable definition, that has to be called democracy.
Yes, voting is not democracy. It's that consultation process. That's democracy. Yeah. Let's move on to China. I'm going to bring in a photograph which you responded to. This I thought I followed this guy Gallagher because I find him so interesting. It gives me so much information, so much ammunition, if you like. So he says, let me put it provocatively. So instead of being reasonable about anything, he wants to be provocative. We can actually wage a Cold War with the creativity and the clarity with which we waged against the Soviet Union, recognizing that there are much worse things than a Cold War. One of them is a hot war, which I think is what he would like to see. And then the surrender. Now, as far as Representative Gallagher is concerned, Mike Gallagher, there's only one option for him: destroy China. There is no alternative option: surrender. And I wanted to ask you about your comment to this. The Chinese want to displace us, want to disrupt and destroy our existing order? No, they don't. How do you know this?
Well, I suppose it's the conclusion from quite a few years now of looking at China closely, learning things about its history. I was sort of forced into this China debate circa 2015, 2016, 2017. And I hadn't spent much time on it before, except to admire, from our party would write articles. Oh, look at China's economic development. It's really impressive, right? From the 90s onwards. But that's
how did you see that? Because when I read economic reports about China, generally I'm reading about the economic collapse, the coming collapse, the pending collapse. Are you going back to before these? Because that's 20 years ago now. Gordon Chang wasn't the start of it, but he's the most famous of them. But his book is more than 20 years old now, and it was coming. It's still coming, and he's still getting on Fox News on a regular basis. But how did you see the difference that others are not seeing?
Well, Jerry, as you know, our party, which is an Australian political party, the Citizens Party, we have a relationship with an organization that's in America and Europe called the Schiller Institute, headed by Helga Zepp LaRouche, and she's the wife of an late American economist named Lyndon LaRouche. And Lyndon LaRouche always described himself as a physical economist because he had this really important insight into the fact that you shouldn't measure, although we do it a lot with GDP, etc., measuring an economy in money is really flawed because money is a metric that can become suddenly worthless, right? It's not a good enough picture. And so what you need to do is measure an economy in physical metrics, and that tells you if the economy is growing or not. And he emphasized, and this is where a lot of my economic perspective came from, the fundamental importance of infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is crucial. Unless there's this, it's a capital investment. And any businessman would get the comparison. A business that produces physical goods, if they're not constantly investing in their capital equipment, they will fall behind. They can temporarily make profits and even increase their profits by drawing down their capital, right, and using it up. But then they'll fall off a cliff. You've got to keep investing in that. And so when you see, it becomes a really almost a fairly basic way of assessing an economy. How are they going with their infrastructure investment? What does that look like? right? And so we would look around the world at this, and in 1996, Helga LaRouche, representing the Schiller Institute, actually attended this very important conference in Beijing on the World Land Bridge. And she presented a paper there because this is a concept we'd talked about. Look, there's a potential for the whole world to be connected with rail infrastructure and better maritime infrastructure, etc. And out of this process of deliberation in China came Belt and Road, right? And so we're part of a movement around the world that actually participated in the thinking that went into this. And so because we see that as the value of an economy, then you're just looking at, okay, how's the infrastructure building going? And China was just, everything coming out of China was amazing. I mean, I remember the Three Gorges Dam, completing the Three Gorges Dam was the big one. You know, a couple of years ago, these idiots were losing their mind. Oh, the Three Gorges Dam is going to break, you know, because it's flexing and whatever. You know, it's just such propaganda being pumped out by the China haters. But you know, this was a massive project, and in Australia, it was appealing to what we talk about in Australia because we used to do this kind of thing. We have a really impressive project. I'll try and point to it. This area,
Snowy Mountains.
The Snowy Mountains, right? We turned rivers that flowed into the sea, and we turned them inland, and we watered a desert and created one of them, not only the most productive food bowl in Australia, but impressively one of the most productive food bowls in the world by doing that. And so the kind of thing, the kind of can-do thing that China does all the time, we were doing it as well, right? So we're impressed, but we don't do that anymore. And so we're looking at our countries declining, and America's especially. Yeah, do you ever see the video that the American Institute of Engineers, I think they're called The Crumbling of America? And it's just about the quality of their infrastructure. And, you know, there was a bridge collapse about 15 years ago in a place like Minneapolis or something. You know, and people died when the bridge collapsed. And the engineers came out and said, look, there's about 70,000 bridges.
Yep, I've seen
America
this. And they still haven't been fixed.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous, you know, because now here's what we conclude from that. That you can claim that you're the richest country in the world, but you're not really if you can't invest in infrastructure, if you can't pay your people properly. You're not really the richest country in the world. You're just kidding. You may have the richest people in the world, but that doesn't make you the richest country in the world. And we were seeing out of China real economic growth, and we were very, very impressed with it. And that's what gave us a perspective to see China's rise. And then here's America sinking, and they can only see it in relative terms. And they're going, well, that China's rise must be a threat to us. We have to attack them.
Did Lyndon LaRouche end his life in prison?
No. He was.
He went to prison for a while.
About 96, I think, when he died in 2019. He went to prison. It's very important you raise this because it relates to Julian Assange. He went to prison in 1988, and he was in prison until 1994. And when I first, as a young political activist, when I first met this political movement, he was in prison, and it was a really stark thing to you know. And I studied the LaRouche case, and his lawyer was Ramsey Clark, who had been Lyndon Johnson's Attorney General, and Ramsey Clark had a really stark analysis of the LaRouche case. He called it the greatest example of government misconduct he'd ever seen, because they railroaded him into jail on these trumped-up charges. But the key bit that relates to Assange is this: LaRouche the FBI had and the Department of Justice had initially brought the charges against LaRouche in Boston. And the judge there threw it out because it was such a ridiculous case. He threw it out. Now, that should have been enough under double jeopardy laws, but no, they broke all the rules, and they took the case to Virginia, into a circuit court that's in the area where Langley, Virginia is, etc. And it's a notorious court. It's called the Rocket Docket. It's where the government gets their man because they can rig the jury. Half the people work for the CIA and whatever. And if Julian and LaRouche was found guilty there and sentenced to 15 years in jail, but he got out in 1994, if Julian Assange is extradited, the hearing just completed today in the UK. It's just happened. We don't know the result yet.
Yeah.
But if he gets extradited, he's going to go through that court, that same court, the Rocket Docket. There's no way he's not going to be found guilty. And that's why Stella, his wife, is blowing the whistle that the CIA is out to kill him. But LaRouche's experience shows you how this sort of faction that is controlling America now, they weren't in total control. They seem to be they are in total control now, but they weren't in total control then. And the reason they went for him is because he actually did get some significant influence in the broader Reagan administration. And later on, one of the factions, he called them the neocons, the neoconservatives, the plotters for the Iraq War. These are the people who became LaRouche's enemies and made sure he was railroaded into jail, right? Because they play for keeps. And they had an agenda. And their agenda was the Cold War was coming to an end, of course. This was 88, 89, the wall came down. All the signs were there that would happen. And their agenda was, we're going to create America as the sole superpower, right? And we are not going to give up that position. And we will reserve the right to preemptively attack any country that threatens us economically or militarily. And it was always aimed at China, but also Russia, etc.
There actually, just yesterday, I saw the first time ever calls for a nuclear attack, a preemptive nuclear attack on China from people who are not in mental institutions. This is the most amazing thing when you ought to be, if you're starting to do that. When you start to see things like this are coming out on mainstream media, and Twitter or X is mainstream now, and you're seeing people who have positions in government and they're advisors to military, advisors to government, saying things like this. They're convinced that China is ready to attack Taiwan, but they were convinced last year that it was going to happen before Christmas, and then it was going to happen after Christmas. And now, how long has China been on the cusp of attacking? It's about as long as Iran has been on the cusp of having a nuclear bomb.
That's right. Well, and to go back to your question about Representative Faceache, and my response to him on Twitter, it's why I go really hard as I do on our show on Twitter, because what the Iraq War taught me was that the road to war is paved with lies.
Yep.
And the big type of lie is the demonization of the other. You have to make that other, that adversary, you have to turn them into pure evil in your people's minds.
Yep.
Right? They have to see this as pure evil and be totally gripped with fear about it. And I remember in the Gulf War in 1990, I would have been 16. My father bought me a subscription to Time magazine, and the first issue I opened in 1990 of Time magazine, it's talking about the build up to the Gulf War, and they're describing Saddam's army and how big it was. And are we going to? In retrospect, it was a joke. Of course, they're always going to beat Saddam's army, right? But can we beat this thing, etc.? Will they introduce conscription? I can remember getting a flood of fear reading this in my, I'm a 16-year-old, right? I'm thinking,
God, I'm going to war.
What's going to happen? This kind of. And because there's this monster, we've got to defeat this guy. Years later, just before they executed Saddam, many years later, he was debriefed by a former CIA official who then wrote a whole paper on it saying, "I think we got this guy wrong," because it was quite an extraordinary acknowledgement that when you hear this stuff, whether it's about the North Korea or Iran or whatever, so much of it is just propaganda. But what it does do, it serves the purpose in the United States where it matters. And in the minds of those congressmen, those analysts, etc., they think that they're dealing with pure evil. Therefore, they are willing to countenance committing evil acts themselves
preemptively,
because what they're dealing with is a greater evil.
Yeah.
And if they actually knew that they'd been lied to, and that what they're about to cause is the evil, right? Then maybe it wouldn't happen. But they can't let people think that way.
Yeah.
And I reckon the people who are the real manipulators in this, they probably think they can manage the process, because no one in their right mind would want to blow up the world in nuclear war. But what they want to do is justify the spending on armaments, etc. So they've got to keep it on a simmer, on a slow boil. But what they're doing is putting us at risk of mistakes that will tip it over into a hot war.
Well, the only thing I can say is that China is the only country in the world that has committed, from the day they tested the first bomb, committed to no first strike. Mao did that, and it's been continued ever since. China's the only country. Now, there are several other countries that have committed to no first strike with a condition, and that means they will never first strike a weaker power. So, in other words, Pakistan might first strike America. Yeah, that could be the way that goes. But China is the only country in the world that has committed, we will not first strike. So this idea of preemptively striking is effectively saying to China, we're thinking about a first strike on you. So if we do that, it's okay for you to strike back. That's
Hitler committed the crime of preventive war, right? That he justified, I've got to attack first because we're under attack. And that was declared illegal at Nuremberg and by the UN Charter, etc. However, the Americans normalized it with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Right? They revived the doctrine of preventive war, and this has become an accepted thing ever since. But you're right. I remember a couple of years ago, I read this really important analysis about the 1964 declaration of China that it will not commit a first strike at nuclear attack. And the analysis I actually read is that declaration, more than anything else, is what has kept the nuclear peace for the whole world, because here you had the Russians and the Americans both developing the bomb, and then China independently developed the bomb, but made this declaration the other two hadn't done, right? Yeah. And very importantly, it took the heat out of it to a degree, and set a standard. And then the Russians and Americans have not committed to a no first strike, of course. That's different, but it gave them something very important to have to think about, because this third force came in and did that. And I agree, and that's a good for the world, Jerry, clearly. But I'd been brought up to be told that Mao Zedong was an unreconstructed monster and pure evil.
It's very hard to defend Mao. What you can do is you can go back and see what he did. And he did some incredible and amazing things. He was a real leader. The best way to look at Mao is through the eyes of someone like Edgar Snow, who was a Westerner looking at him, looking closely at him. And even read his books. People say, I'm not reading that. The things he says and the things that he did all matched. Xi Jinping is the same. Pretty much every leader who has arrived at the top level of China's leadership has done the same thing. They've written their books, they have their thoughts and their theories, and they end up being part of the Constitution. I lived here so long, sometimes I say our when I mean Chinese. And that's part of Chinese language. It's always called our China. The whole process needs to be looked at from this. What do people in China's leadership actually say? And then if we follow that through, what have they done? And we can find that for the most part, there were some mistakes. I mean, the Great Leap Forward was a mistake, and Mao admitted that. The Cultural Revolution was not a mistake, but it got completely out of hand and out of control. And I think Mao was probably by then too old to manage something like that. He really wanted to do, he had something he wanted to achieve. And there's things that came out of both of those mistakes that are still beneficial today. It's not me defending either of them. It's just a fact that there are things, for example, the Industrial Revolution that China had came from the Great Leap Forward. And where we are today in China is a direct result of the mistakes of the Great Leap Forward. So that's the difference between the West and China. They learn from the mistakes. And Mao is, you can say all the negative things you like about the Cultural Revolution, but he's the man who brought China together, created the one language, created the one written language, simplified it so we have 99% literacy. He's improved every single measurable metric for Chinese people, and it's constantly improved since his day. So in that respect, you can criticize him all you like for the Cultural Revolution, but he's definitely not the monster that we thought he was when we were growing up.
Of course, when we there was a lot of effort put into making us think he was. I just want people. I want to take the hysteria out of the whole discussion that rages in countries like Australia and America. And if we in our party, etc., can achieve at least people looking at China as a normal country, not and that makes mistakes and does good things as well, but not like the mistakes are not pure evil and etc. Right? Just look at things on its merits and take out the histrionics. I think we will have achieved something. We make mistakes. Our mistakes have consequences. I mean, America makes mistakes all the time, and they tend to be usually around wars that are always concluded to be a mistake. But meanwhile, millions have died from those wars.
And then they go and do it again.
And then they go and do it again. And that's okay. That's not them being monsters, apparently. But Mao was a monster, right? Or in economic policy, we've made terrible mistakes. That's had consequences. That kills people. I remember when they deconstructed our productive economy in Australia. It's had enormous knock-on effects. It's undermined our infrastructure. People have died as a result of it, etc. And that's just. I mean, it's not only is it not acknowledged to be a mistake. Often it's called progress, and it's really perverse. Or we have these heroes in the West, like Winston Churchill. The great Winston Churchill. Well, actually, go and look at Winston Churchill in a bit of detail. Look what he did to India in the 1943 famine in Bengal, right?
That was actually just mentioned in the comments.
Exactly. You know, and so anyway, we've got to stop applying a double standard and just take a country on its merits and admire what deserves to be admired. If you want to criticize it for something because you think it deserves criticism, there's also a way you can go about that. Are you doing it in goodwill? And if you're doing it in goodwill, then you would try and look for the most effective way to do it rather than grandstanding like our Prime Minister Scott Morrison did in 2020, where he tried to be as embarrassing to China as he could be deliberately because the Americans wanted him to be. And the Chinese said, okay, we've had it with you and, we're not going to trade with you guys much anymore.
Yeah, well, it wasn't quite so bad as that because they continued trading and he got his reward in the end, didn't he?
Oh, you saw that? Yep. No,
I wrote an article. I wrote an article, but unfortunately, it got rejected. It was about how Murdoch promoted him to where he was. Murdoch created what he was, and then Murdoch rewarded him because Murdoch is one of the senior fellows in the Hudson Institute, which is where he got his first gig. And even that was an interesting one because it was a kind of a conflict of interest. He was still serving as an MP when he got that. Now he's moved into other security, what do they call it? The security consultancy industry, which basically means he's just going to get paid for going to meetings and expressing opinions.
Well, he has two private sector jobs now. One is with a consultancy firm started by the former National Security Advisor of the United States, Robert O'Brien. And the firm is called American Global Strategies. So here's the former Prime Minister of Australia who committed us to this AUKUS partnership that's now going to cost us nearly $400 billion to buy American weapons. And he's now going to work for American Global Strategies. I mean, what does that tell you? And the other one is an outfit called Dine International, which he's joined with Mike Pompeo. Yep. His partner in crime, I reckon these two are. And this Dine company, a venture capital firm that started to make money out of AUKUS. So here's Morrison creates the AUKUS Pact with this massive increase in defense expenditure associated with it. And now he's getting to cash in on that in his post.
Hudson are another one making money out of AUKUS as well. So he's on both. He's on the board.
All Hudson's funders, exactly. And the other one is The other one is CSIS, Center for
Strategic Studies.
Center for New American CNAS, Center for New American Security.
Okay.
Both of them are heavily funded by the big weapons manufacturers that are all going to make money out of AUKUS.
Okay, let's move on, because I was going to ask you this, and someone's come up in the questions and asked this. Off topic, changing topic. You and Drew Pavlou seem to have a. I love your name for him. Can I say that out loud? Squealer.
Squealer.
Yeah. Is he gaining or losing? I haven't seen very much of him recently. Is he gaining or losing, or has he just given up? What's he doing?
Do you know the reference, the Squealer reference, where it comes from?
Is it from Lord of the Flies?
No, close. Animal Farm.
Oh yeah, okay.
Squealer is Napoleon's propaganda guy. PR
Oh,
guy,
right.
right?
Okay.
2 legs good, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, right? All animals are created equal, but some are more equal than others, right? Squealer would proclaim those things. And anyway, I used to think Drew Pavlou was mostly misguided, but what he is now, shamelessly, is someone who's just a shill, a grifter. He's desperately trying to cash in. He's begging Elon Musk to pay him properly for his agitating on Twitter, or X, they'd like to call it. Now, the model, what is perverse is the model of making money out of the internet nowadays, because we have a YouTube channel, you have a YouTube channel, and we've deliberately, I don't criticize people who do monetize YouTube. That's not so, but we haven't. We've done that specifically for a reason. We do not want to become dependent on Google for our revenue, right? We get our revenue as a political party from the donations of Australians, because if you become dependent on Google or X or whatever for your revenue, then you're going to want eyeballs on your channel. And what gets eyeballs is, well, sometimes it's good analysis, but more often than not, it's extreme, it's sensational, it's rubbish. And so Drew Pavlou on X, he's just a total provocateur. He doesn't believe half of what he's saying. He's just trying to bait as many people as possible, get as many furious reactions as possible, so that he can generate activity on his channel, so more ads get played on his X channel, and he gets revenue from that. That's what he's trying to do. And there's no principle involved. He's now bagging Julian Assange, right? He's hoping Julian Assange gets extradited, etc. He's calling, and frankly, Julian, I'm Australian. You're part Australian, Jerry. Drew Pavlou is an Australian, but Julian Assange is an Australian. He's a great Australian, and it's not about the nature. It's not about the perfectness of his personality. He put everything on the line to do a service for the good, right? To unmask a great evil, which is the great evil of our time, which the American president in 1960 warned about. And back then it was a shadow of what it is now, right? The military-industrial complex. And he has suffered for it immensely. And as in terms of moral standing, little Drew Pavlou, who someone got a hold of him in university and literally gave him a brain transplant to make him think that everything the Americans and the British do is wonderful, and that's democratic, and China and Russia are absolutely evil. He's got that in his head. He does not compare to an Assange figure at all. So what I've tried to do is actually mostly ignore him. Now, I have a friend, Warwick, who makes fun of me. He says, I see what you're doing. You're trying to ignore Drew, and then every now and then you just say, come here, and you have to.
Is this Warwick Powell?
Warwick Powell, yeah. You have to lash out.
I'm interviewing Warwick next week.
Oh, good. Because sometimes he gets you go. I often tweet things at Drew and say, learn something, right? I don't want to be too antagonistic, but anyway, the thing with Drew, though, is it's an interesting update for your channel. Drew has burned all his bridges with the different political groups in Australia who are sympathetic to him because of his personality. He's actually an obnoxious little turd. Yep. He seriously is. Nobody can work with him. But the nasty China hater crowd who worked with him most, they just used him, right? He was useful to a purpose. The Murdoch media or the Nine media will still run stories on him for sensational China bashing propaganda value,
right?
But nobody will work with him. Nobody will give him a role in their political parties, etc., because he's completely impossible to work with, and he's going to end up sad and used up and spat out.
He'll probably be selling vegetables in his parents' shop.
Probably.
Mm.
I mean, he thinks
because seriously, he's totally uncontrollable in any kind of managed environment. He does not know. I mean, that's the view that I get. I don't know how much control he has over his antics, his own antics. But
he's got issues. He thinks he's Australia's Alexei Navalny, but what he doesn't know is Alexei Navalny is not even Alexei Navalny. He's a myth. He's a propaganda puppet, right? Yeah. And that's what he does have in common with Drew. Drew is just a propaganda puppet. He just doesn't know what that thing up his ass. Sorry, don't want to be too crude. The hand up his butt is.
Yeah, even his mother doesn't want him. Okay, let's move on to the last topic I had for today, which was I got a question. It was on my YouTube channel. It said, why is it that Western countries are against the cashless method? Is this because they don't trust the government and mainland Chinese do? Now, I don't know if the respondent was a Chinese person, but inside of China, people do trust their government, and we love the cashless society. Now, my response to that was, it's mostly about infrastructure, but there is a degree of trust. And I love you touched on it at the beginning. The infrastructure isn't there, but I wanted to talk about the situation where Optus dropped us, and maybe you can. Well, it actually happened, didn't it?
Sure,
and
sure.
Maybe you can convince me why it's a bad idea. But I've basically been cashless now for about 7 years. And I don't even do it anymore, but I used to, in my phone, I used to have 100 RMB note in there. And people say, why are you carrying that? Just in case. I've never needed it.
Well, I stand to be corrected on this, but I saw an analysis not that long ago that there is still some requirement for Chinese businesses to accept cash if they're paid in cash.
Oh, not some requirement, it's law. They must.
Okay, so if we achieve that in Australia, I don't care if nobody uses it, as long as it's required to be accepted if people want to use it.
Okay.
But there's another qualitative difference, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning of this. In China, the government is more powerful than the corporations, including the banks. In Australia, the banks are more powerful than the government. And so it's the banks that want to push us cashless. And what cashless means in terms of a mechanism is if your bank is a well-behaved bank under the control, like that follows the law, that I can understand people thinking of it differently than what I'm about to describe. But our banks are not. They determine the law. And when you're making a cashless transaction, you may not know this, but you're asking the bank, and often Visa or MasterCard or whatever, for permission to transact. Now, it's automatic, it's given, but it's all programmed in. But just because it's programmed in doesn't mean it can't be unprogrammed. Yes. And there are examples of it. And I didn't get caught up in it as much, but the Canadians did this when there was a big, anti-lockdown and anti-vax protest. Suddenly the Canadian government flexed their arms and said to the banks, cut off their money. Right? Cash in that context does represent freedom. You can, it's the currency of the state, right? And you can use that legal tender entirely independently of private corporations who may try and stop you. Now, generally, they're not going to try and stop you, because what they're going to try and do, though, is they've got this system of, years ago, banks used to make their money by helping you make money. That was the banking model. Right. All right, we'll lend you money because That's a good risk. You're going to make money by doing that. You'll make enough to pay us back. That's earned us something on our money. That's helped you make money. That model changed in the 90s, and it's pretty much gone now. Banks make their money by just taking a cut. They fleece, right? They've got all, and it's not just unique to banks. So many things we do, Jerry, involve signing up, using our credit card to a monthly fee, right? The television model now, no one watches TV anymore. You pay Netflix a monthly fee to watch your TV. The banks have mastered this the most. And what they're doing is they're getting a cut of every transaction and they're getting your data. And they want all your data because now that could be used for sinister purposes. So there is a risk there, but that's a secondary risk. They will monetize your data for them, right? And you're handing yourself entirely over to that. And again, if your banks are law-abiding banks and the government is genuinely responsible for the people and says, okay, this is what's good for the people and we're going to protect them from what's not, that'd be one thing. But in Australia, we don't have that. We have banks that are a law unto themselves. They're gouging and screwing us every turn they can get, and they're trying to. The reason they're shutting branches and taking out ATMs, they're trying to force people before we're ready into this completely. So if we can actually achieve a government law that says everyone must take cash, and the banks must make sure cash is available, so that we can have the option to avoid that kind of system if we don't like it. Plus, we're secure in a failure, like a power failure, an internet failure, a natural disaster. Australia is subjected to a lot of those things, right? And we can keep transacting because we've got availability of cash. We'll be happy with that. Yes, eventually we'll be like the Jetsons. This cartoon, Jetsons. We will be like that one day, but we're not, especially in Australia, we're not there yet. And that's decades and decades and decades away.
So do you think it really is just a matter of infrastructure? Because when you say the banks are going to need to give cash and people are going to be required to accept cash, then you've still got the situations. What if there's no bank? Where do you go for your cash?
I know. Well, that's what this problem is. In a sense, what we've done is almost too late. Like politicians were asleep for too long and they let this happen in a big way. It's got way too bad. So that's why we want to start a post office bank, a government post office bank. So it's a government bank where the government owns the bank and it's all secure deposits for the people, etc. But it operates through the post office, which has the biggest retail footprint in the country. And in fact, we have a great map. I wish I could show it to you, but we have a map of all the post offices in Australia. Yeah. And what you see, what's most impressive, up the middle, there's all these dots there, where there's post offices. No private company has that.
No.
But the post office does because it's a service. And so there's 4,000 post offices, which is more than all the private banks combined. And they could provide banking services and be the place you get cash. And what the private banks will do, if they have to compete with that, is realize, well, that's such a good service. We're going to lose all our customers to that. We better raise our game, and they'll start providing the infrastructure again as well.
And that's your hope. Yeah. I got an interesting story about China just yesterday. And I thought, I'll share this with you because I think this is an interesting story. We talked just before we came online. You and I have both just recently bought new places to live in. You have a house, I have an apartment. And we moved from one apartment to another apartment. But because the market, the property crash, the market is subdued right now. It hasn't crashed. It's under control. It's a controlled free fall, but it is under control. And it's probably reached the bottom and starting to come out. But we found an apartment that we liked and we said, well, let's buy it. We've got some savings. We've got some money in the bank. We can buy this apartment for cash and we'll move out. But we won't sell this one because if we sell it, we'll sell it for, it still won't be less than I paid, but less than I want to get for it because we lived in the other apartment for a few years. We only paid, you're going to hate this. We bought it 14 years ago for 240,000 RMB, which is about, divide that by 5, 200, it's $50,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment. We're now in a 3-bedroom apartment. Now you're going to love this one too. We just paid 550,000 RMB for this one. And we needed to basically, once we've got it, we said, we've got to gut this, we've got to renovate it. So we stayed in the old house and spent a month renovating this, but we had to borrow 200,000 RMB to renovate it. So we've borrowed 200,000, it's about 40,000 Australian, 30,000 US dollars to completely renovate it. Everything in this house is new. All the windows, all except the back door. Everything is brand new. All the wiring, all the floors, all the ceilings, all the cupboards, everything brand new. The whole house was gutted back to bare concrete and then rebuilt. So we got new kitchen, new bathroom, the whole lot for 50,000 Australian dollars. And that took a month. So there you go. That's probably a better system. Now, that's not the story I was going to tell you. My wife did this all online, borrowed money. She at one stage, she had to go to the bank. But all she had to do when she went to the bank, effectively, she sat down with the guy who was going to approve this. And he said, well, just scan this code for me with your phone. She scanned the code and she said, okay, yeah, you can borrow up to 300,000 over 3 years. This is not a mortgage, so we're going to pay this back over. So we ended up borrowing 200,000 over 3 years. But it was all done on the phone, and she made a mistake. She clicked the button that's where it said, when are you going to use the money? She said within 3 months. So it was within 3 months, within 1 year, within 2 years, within 3 years. And she clicked within 3 months, without realizing she'd made a mistake, that within 3 months she had to pay the money back. So we were in a bit of a dire straits here. Oh my God. The day we found this out, we got a phone call from the bank saying, you realize next week you got to pay that 200,000 RMB back. And we're, no, we've got 3 years to do that. No, you've got 4 days left. What? So it was a mistake. Now in China, there's a law that says you can't borrow to pay back a loan. So the bank says, well, we can't help you. We can't, you have to give us 200,000. But the minute you give it to us, you can borrow it again because you've got a 3-year revolving loan.
Right.
So she's, well, what are we going to do? So she contacted a couple of family members, aunties and cousins, and borrowed 200,000. So she got 200,000 cash transferred from an auntie into her bank account. She paid the bank, borrowed 200,000 back from the bank, and paid the auntie. So now we owe the bank again, but this time we've got 2 years and 9 months. So she's ticked the right box this time. So then that all happened about 10 days ago. All sorted, no big problems, and we forgot about it. It's done. We owe the bank money. We know about that. We don't owe the family any money at all. We just borrowed it for literally a day. We borrowed 200,000. Next day it was paid off, paid back. So then yesterday my wife got a phone call, and it was from the police. And we thought, why are they calling? I mean, sometimes they call to check on my residence and stuff like that because you need to be registered to live in the house. And because it's Chinese New Year when we moved in, I haven't been and registered, but there's no big deal about that. We'll do that this week. But no. They said, we think you may have been the victim of a scam. And she said, what do you mean? Well, there's a lot of money being transferred in and out of your account. So she said, oh, no. And she explained it over the phone, no problem. And they said, but we need to come and see you. So, and she said, okay, when are you coming? We're outside now. What? Literally 2 minutes later, they were in the door and having a nice chat. I mean, really friendly guys. And they were concerned that she may have been the victim of a scam. And that's why this money was moving around in her bank account. So as far as they were concerned, on her phone, she had paid off 400,000 2 different occasions because she'd paid the bank and then she'd paid an auntie, and they were really worried about that. So they came in, chatted for 5 or 10 minutes, and said hello to me. Oh yeah, where are you from? And we had a little chat about that, and then they helped her. They put an app on her telephone to help her to identify scams, because it's the only crime in China that's actually rising. All other crimes, burglaries, robberies, rapes, murders, they're all decreased, all virtually crime-free. But the only crime that's on the increase is international telephone scams.
Yeah.
So when people say, you're being monitored. I say, yeah, thank goodness for that. They were checking on us. If there'd been a problem, my wife would have had some kind of protection there. But I'm glad they came because they wanted to see her in her environment, make sure that she wasn't in any kind of stress or coercion. And I thought it was all quite good. I thought I might write an article about that and maybe make a video. But then I remember I'm talking to Robbie tomorrow about banking. Let's bring this one up.
But you're an ex-policeman, so you have, what it's like to try and track crime and protect people from that sort of thing. And it is an important perspective. I think it's one of the reasons that we're on this campaign to save bank branches, because I don't know that we have something that I'm not sure we have a police force surveillance. Though the federal police and others probably do have some kind of proactive role looking at scams. They would certainly be hunting down the scammers. But it's our big four banks are so big, they are expected to be ahead of the game on this. But the problem, look, all the benefits that the internet technology brings, Jerry, are great, but they have these risks. They have these risks that they will always have because it's all programmable. You're trying to stay ahead of very inventive people. The criminal mind is incredibly inventive, right?
Yeah.
And the criminal financial mind is really inventive, and you can supercharge that with computer programming, and you can come up with all sorts of elaborate stuff that people can fall for. And that's why. So my kids, I got a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old. They are savvy. They're internet savvy, right? Their grandfather is not. So their grandfather is more susceptible to scams,
correct,
than my kids are. I'm probably a bit more susceptible to scams than my kids are, but that's not to say they're bulletproof. They're not, right? The scams will get more sophisticated, but there is a certain type of person, and there's millions of them in society that are. We live in aging societies. They are very, very vulnerable to this, and they should not be forced to go into an area that terrifies them, online banking, by banks who just want to maximize their profits at their expense. Up until this internet stuff came along, banking was always 100% certain activity. You walked into the bank, you spoke to the teller, you did your business, you left. Everything was certain about it. The elderly in society today grew up with banking being an absolute certainty. Now they're being told they've got to be exposed to something where there's all these risks, and they're the number one target for the risks, for the scams, right? And even the act of doing it is uncertain, because you can make little mistakes like your wife made, etc. Right? And then so that's why we're saying to the banks, and we're saying to the government, you cannot let the banks force frog march us into this future that benefits them and expose us to all these risks in the meantime. And can I give a plug for an American YouTube channel? It's called Mark Rober. Mark Rober is a former NASA engineer who has this really great YouTube channel. Kids love it, and he does all these fantastic experiment stuff. It's a huge channel. He's got like 30 million followers.
Is it Rober? R-O-B-E-R?
R-O-B-E-R. Leaves us for dead. But he's the guy who made the glitter bomb for the people who steal packages. You might have heard of this. That in America, Amazon packages left on your doorstep. People just go along and steal them. And so he made a glitter bomb for people who do that. And he put phones in this package, and it explodes with glitter when it's opened up. And he's filming the crooks who's stolen his package. It made a lot of news a few years ago. He's a really clever guy. But he's done some really eye-opening stuff on the sophistication of these scams. He's done a few episodes on these online banking scams. And when you look at it, my jaw dropped. I would fall for some of this stuff. They make these scams are so sophisticated, it's not funny. And that's why you need to, that's always going to be a risk. We've got to have systems in place to preserve against that risk. And in a country like Australia, at least, part of that system needs That's I saw that comment, Lowy. No, he's big. My kid put me onto him. In Australia, at least, there is a protection from those scams, which is your bank branch.
Yeah, in China now, what they've done, they've put this app. Of course, now everybody in the West will say, "Oh, they're monitoring her app." Well, no, they're already monitoring her phone because they know where there's money moved around. So it's not that big a secret. If we've got any kind of app on our phone, it's not an additional monitoring. It's a protective thing. They've put this phone, and any number that is suspicious, it will now tell her this is a suspicious number. Now, interestingly, one of the numbers on there is any number starting with 400. Which I think is any Skype call. And we're fortunate we don't use Skype very much, but we do have family overseas. So occasionally there might be a 400, but it'll come up as this is a dodgy number, and it blocks all of the ones that they know. It automatically, they have the system when they know a number is a bad number. This app will automatically block it, so she'll just get a blocked call. But if a 400 number comes in, it'll get a warning. This is a scam. This could be a scam. Now, if she picks it up and it's her sister calling, well, it's not a big deal. But there's another little aspect to this that I think probably needs to be raised. We phoned around and we had two people said to us, no problem, we can lend you 200,000, don't worry about it. And I thought, if I was in the UK or in Australia, how many people would I know that I could go to and just say, can you lend me 50,000 RMB, $50,000 or 30,000 pounds? I can't think of anybody that I would know well enough to be able to do that. I mean, I know plenty of, I've got family, brothers, sisters, cousins, aunties, uncles, but I don't know any of them who'd have a spare 30, 40, 50,000 pounds.
I mean, it's a really good example of the different nature of the economy in China. I mean, I remember reading, the Chinese are great savers.
Yeah.
But this cost of living crisis that we're going through, it is an enormous problem, and part of the problem is it's the product of the work we've done over the years to undermine our own economy. Yeah. Right? When you have an economy that's incredibly productive, like China's is, a byproduct of that is you get to do things quite cheaply. I'm not saying cheap products. I mean, the process of doing stuff is cheap.
Yeah, the supply chain is cheaper. Yeah,
supply chain is cheap. We have deliberately exposed ourselves through ideology to great expense and fragility in our supply chains.
Right.
And it's just everywhere you turn, you're being charged through the nose for everything, and people don't have spare money. And we've had the fastest interest rate rises in history in the last 2 years. They jacked up the main cash rate from 0.1%. It's called the central bank rate. Went from 0.1% to 4.35% in 13 interest rate rises in less than 2 years. And that has, we talked about it last time, right? That has saddled, if you had a $2,000 monthly mortgage repayment, you've now got over $4,000 monthly mortgage repayment. And that's a huge whack on the household budget. And people don't have spare money lying around at all. It's very unusual. You'd have to be quite well off already to be able to do what you just described. It would not be indicative of the average person.
And none of my wife's family are well off. In fact, one of the people who said they can do this was a friend of ours who's a Canadian, and they had money locked away. He and his wife is Chinese, he's Canadian. They had money locked away because he was getting his permanent residency. So you have to lock away 200,000, and they had some money locked away for 6 months. But they had left it there. They already got the permanent residency sorted out. They'd left it there for a year because you get a very good interest payment. And they basically said, well, don't worry about it. We'll get this money out. We'll lose the interest payment, but the money is yours. And I said, well, if that happens, we'll pay you the interest that you would have got because of this, because they're only a month or so away from their 12-month deadline. So in that respect, that was great that they were able to do that. But the other family was just my wife's auntie who just said, oh, no problem. We'll send you 200,000 tomorrow. Just like that. Now, there's an add-on to that. And it was this is a collapsing economy. Our inflation rate is negative. It's minus 0.03 right now, and that's all over the West as we're going through deflation. So this is a terrible problem. The other thing is that Chinese people in 2022 saved 2.6 trillion US dollars into their bank accounts. 2.6 trillion. Now that's almost the GDP of the United Kingdom. In 1 year, Chinese people saved the GDP of the United Kingdom. That's one of the top 10 countries of GDP in the world. And we saved it. I had some money, obviously, because I just bought an apartment. Now I have no money in the bank account, but it'll rebuild itself because I've got money coming in from different places. But really is an interesting way to look at China and say it's collapsing. It has a 5.2% growth rate. It has stagnant inflation, not really deflation. 0.3 is not a serious problem. And it also has the world's largest manufacturing capacity, the world's largest export capacity, and yet it's collapsing. I'm not sure how this can be done.
Well, that was back to your question about the congressman, making all these claims about, we need a Cold War and all this kind of stuff. And these people, they just believe what they want to believe about China. And despite all the evidence to the contrary, and I use it as an example. You think China's collapsing, and you thought so for years, and it hasn't collapsed. You think China's a threat. You've been convinced to think of that, and it hasn't invaded anybody, or hasn't dropped any bombs since, for 40 years or whatever, 50 years or something, right? Yeah. The evidence contradicts every belief you have. When are you going to change your belief?
Wake up. I just want to answer this question and another question. Will I rent the other property? The answer is no. We're not capitalists. We own a property, which is quite a cheap property. We bought another property, which was a cheap property. And when the time is right, we'll sell the other one. At the moment, we've got a friend staying in there. It's not quite rent-free. He's paying expenses and stuff, but it's a favor to a friend who's traveling from overseas, and he's borrowed the apartment for a month. So no, we're not going to rent it out. It's on the market. If we get the price we want, we'll sell it. We're definitely not capitalists, and then we'll pay back the money that we owe the bank. Finally. Yeah.
Well, we won't be capitalists.
Yeah. We're getting towards that hour and a half mark where we should really think about winding up. Where do people find the Citizens Party?
All right. Well, we're very active on YouTube, and that's just called the Australian Citizens Party, and we have a weekly show there called the Citizens Report, and I do interviews called Citizens Insight with people. I think you were one of our original interviews, Jerry. Our website is citizensparty.org.au, and you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Telegram, I believe, if you're into something like Telegram. So yeah, and if you're in Australia, get involved. You can become a member. We keep our membership very well informed because we keep them very active. We have the most informed and engaged membership of any political party in Australia. And it's actually the secret to our success, because we get people to participate in the processes of government that are open to the public. And by doing so, we're bringing more perspective of ordinary people into the parliamentary processes, and the politicians learn something. Because if we're not doing that, then the big, powerful, richer vested interests, that they have no competition. Their influence will sway the day. But we get the politicians to saying, hang on, this is what the people are saying is necessary for them. And you can be part of that process, and we need as many people as possible to be part of that process.
So for anyone who's in Australia, it's worth checking the Citizens Party out. I get your newsletters; they're quite informative. The only thing is, I found I can't sign petitions and things like that from here because they ask for my home address, and I can't do that.
Yeah,
well, I
yeah.
can, but then it gets stuck at my postcode is not a 4-digit number.
It's quite limited. I know, but that's okay.
Yeah.
We need the Australians who are here and can vote, etc., to get involved.
Oh, and here's one thing that Trevor puts in there. Before the finish of the stream, please hit the like button. Let's get more people to watch our stuff. And
Absolutely.
just somebody else mentioned, I have another one tomorrow. I'm talking to an American socialist and vegan tomorrow, who's an interesting guy. I've spoken to him a few times before. And we're going to compare the difference between a communist living in, or a socialist living in a capitalist society, and me, a relatively conservative person living in a communist society,
Okay, good.
and how our lives are. So that should be interesting.
Yeah, good.
Once again, Robbie Barwick of the Citizens Party, thank you very much for joining me. And also, thanks everybody. We got up to the 100 viewers, which is pretty good for this time of day, I think, because we're kind of an awkward time for Australians are at work, Chinese people are at work and school. American people are just getting ready for bed. English people, I don't know, what time is it in the UK now? It's after midnight. Trevor's there after midnight again, poor guy. So thanks everybody for joining.
Happy to, Jerry. Keep it up. It's always great coming on your channel, talking to your listeners.
Great. Thank you.